first of the 4 tasks of mourning is to accept the reality of the loss. With regard to physical death of a loved one, we have to face the reality that they have indeed died, and that reunion with them is no longer possible, at least in this life. We do have the hope for reunion with them in eternal life. And so, too, within this pastoral planning process, we need to accept the reality of whatever kinds of loss it may entail for us and for our parishes. And there's really 2 levels of acceptance that we need to have as well. The first is an intellectual acceptance as well as an emotional acceptance. Intellectual acceptance is often much easier, and that's why we went through and explained some of those current realities so that we understand the reasons why we need to go through this pastoral planning process. But just because intellectually we become aware of the reasons for why we need to go through change and maybe agree that they might make sense, we can intellectually accept something perhaps long before our emotions catch up and allow us to fully accept them. So I'll return to that, the emotional acceptance here in a little bit. So with regard to intellectual acceptance, that's why we went through and explained those 3 current realities. First, that of shifting regional demographics. Our rural population is declining. It's been doing that for a long time. We can't deny it. And a lot of this we can't really change. We know that farms have gotten larger and fewer. In 1950, there were fewer than 900 farms here in Nebraska with more than 1,000 acres. But by 2017, there were over 11,000 farms with more than 1,000 acres. We also find that there are fewer young people that are entering into marriage. By 2018, here in Nebraska, there were only 6 marriages per 1,000 people. Those that are getting married are having smaller and smaller families. Go back to the 1800s when we had the peak of our population in our rural area, and there was over 5 people on average per family. And now if we look to 2021, it has dropped down to 2.5 people per family. The second current reality is the declining church population. Fewer Catholics are coming to Mass. More and more people consider themselves to be unaffiliated with any church. In particular, young people are not attending Mass. Our own parishes, too, have not been immune to this decline of Mass attendance. And we've seen already in previous videos that if we choose to do absolutely nothing, then the projections look rather dire. The third current reality is the declining priest availability. We simply don't have the same number of priests that we did in the past. And you can go back and look at the videos where I explained about why some of those common solutions that have been proposed that require everybody else to change so that we don't have to change ultimately don't work. We saw too the statistics of our seminarian numbers that have continued to decline. And while not specifically about priests, we can also see this among our men and women religious for our Archdiocese of Omaha. And that how many, especially women religious, we had in the past that enabled us to be able to have our many more various Catholic schools. But since then, we've had so many fewer and have been related to some of our schools requiring to close. So each of these realities in themselves are a kind of loss that we have to accept. We have to accept our current situation before we can move forward. And I think in the past, there was certain moments of denial of these realities. In the past, different dioceses started planning processes a number of times, but really didn't end up making the needed changes. Sometimes the older plans determined to have to make certain difficult decisions, perhaps even closing parishes, but they ended up not doing it. Some older priests are given the impression that we've just always been doing this pastoral planning, but nothing actually really ever changes or happens. And so maybe we won't have to change things this time either. Sometimes plans in the past were not long range enough to be effective. And so that's why this journey of faith is a 10-year plan, so that it can be more effective based upon our current reality. So we need to accept these things, even though they're real losses. Not if we wish to be able to flourish into the future. We simply can't keep doing the same thing and expect to get different results. As I've been discussing, we need to first accept the reality that requires us to make these changes. But then we also need to accept the changes that we're going to have to make. Changes that will entail other kinds of loss as well. One of the most difficult losses for many people will be the realization that not every church building will be able to have a Sunday Mass. Now, looking at the large groupings we have and comparing that with the parameters of how many Masses that priests are going to be able to do, 4 Masses at 2 locations per priest or 3 Masses at 3 locations per priest, then that means we'll be able to have between 4 to 6 locations maximum per weekend. And so for many of the groupings, that will mean some parishes won't be able to have a Mass on a given weekend. And so for some, this loss might be interpreted as their parish being forced to be closed if they don't have a Sunday Mass. Even though that's really not what the Archdiocese has said. They have not built in the expectation for any parish in particular to close and kind of leave up the decision within our grouping to decide where Masses will be held. Instead, there could potentially be certain parishes that will have to face a further and greater loss where, say, they're a small, perhaps dwindling community, and they decide that maybe it doesn't make sense any longer to continue the upkeep of their church if they no longer have a weekend Mass. And so then they have to make that tough decision to choose for themselves that closing makes sense. And that would be a most difficult loss, not only for that community, but for our whole grouping as well. One that ultimately we'll only be able to accept if we go through this process of grieving. Another potential loss that we have to grieve is that of parishes continually being realigned, moved back and forth between who we're aligned with. Some parishes have had to do that numerous times over the last number of years, and it can be a loss each time of having to try to realign with new communities, new parishes, new pastors. And that's a difficulty too that we will also have to mourn through this process. As I mentioned earlier, all these things might be able to help us intellectually become aware of the reasons for why we need to go through this change and even agree that many of them make sense. But it doesn't necessarily mean we'll be able to emotionally accept it immediately. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with needing time to process grief. It happens with the death of a loved one. It's going to have to be with this planning process as well. But through that, it's important to talk about your concerns, your fears, your anxieties, and I would certainly bring it to prayer. Hopefully we'll talk about that in another video. Being able to bring certain moments of ritual to help us go through the mourning process will be a good thing for us to consider as well. Emotional acceptance is really related to the second task of mourning, which we'll look at in the next video.